We know that, Moses was part of the Hebrew community that was in Egypt and had been for centuries by the
How
time
did
he
they
was
get
born.
there? Is this like the whole Technicolor coat thing?
Yes, Joseph had something to do with it. Hi, Jay.
Hi, Sandy.
How are you?
Fantastic. How are you?
Excellent. Really well. I am super excited, stoked, in fact, to talk about Moses today. This is part of our series called Meet God, where we're learning more about God by examining the relationship he had with certain people in the Bible, specifically Adam and Eve, Noah, Abraham. Today we're talking about Moses, then we'll talk about David, and we're finding just terrific, magnificent information about God when we're looking at these relationships. It's been very insightful.
Absolutely. I love that how we've taken a common optic among all these stories and drawn out just the consistency, the continuity, however you want to call it, of God's character and how he relates to the initial humans. And then obviously we can extrapolate that he's going to do that with us as well.
Yes, I believe that he treats all of his people the same or similar because, of his immense love and care for us. But we're also seeing how God was moving from the Garden of Eden and the fall to redemption by furthering the plan for redemption through these people who all play a critical role in moving the plan to fruition, which happens through our Lord Jesus Christ. So, yeah, let's talk something about Moses.
Absolutely. So, I got a couple questions for you right off the bat because I'm always confused of anything BC gets really mucky to me of like, oh yeah, that happened before Christ, right? Like when exactly before Christ did this happen?
Well, it's interesting you should ask that because we don't really know.
So maybe that's why it's mucky.
Yeah, it's a little bit confusing because scholars think it happened either sometime between the 16th and 14th century BC. So,
Okay.
We don't have the exact dates because it's not specifically located in Egyptian history. So, nevertheless, we know that, Moses was part of the Hebrew community that was in Egypt and had been for centuries by the
How
time
did
he
they
was
get there?
born.
Is this like the whole Technicolor coat thing?
Yes, Joseph had something to do with it. Joseph was one of the children of Jacob, and Joseph ended up in Egypt, I should say. He didn't voluntarily move there. He ended there through slavery.
Yeah. Less than ideal way.
Less than an ideal way, but it turned out fantastic for him because he became a real confidant to the Pharaoh and also was basically ruling over Egypt. So he had a lot of authority. And his family back in Canaan, back in Israel, were undergoing a big famine. They were starving. And ultimately, about 70 members of Joseph's family ended up moving to Egypt. And Joseph took care of them, and they stayed there and they multiplied. And I think they had a pretty good life for the first couple hundred years.
And then something somewhere happened.
Something happened, which is that another leader rose up, another Pharaoh, and he didn't have the same attachment to Joseph. He really didn't care, he could care less. All he saw was that the Hebrew people were really multiplying. Like they were becoming a very big group of people in his land. And he became worried about would they band together and try to, take over power here. And so his answer to that was to enslave them. And thus, they spent a certain amount of time, a few centuries, as free people there. And then the last 140 years, they were enslaved by Pharaoh. So kind of a turn of events that didn't go so well. And maybe they should have left earlier while they had the chance, but they didn't go back to their homeland. Not sure why not.
Well, they could. Yeah, so there's probably a couple hours of talk that we could have there that we won't, but it's an interesting thought.
Yeah. Well, yes. And so ultimately, by the time our hero was born, the Hebrews were enslaved people. They had been growing in population, and there was concern about them continuing to grow in population. So Pharaoh issued an edict, and the edict was that the midwives were to put to death or drown every male child born to Hebrew couples, which is, of course, genocide and a terrible thing that was happening.
It's odd how that thread continues to come about in these ancient stories of like some king feels threatened and he likes to kill babies. It's kind of a weird thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think the value of human life was very different then than it is now. And that's even true in the time of Christianity. The Romans didn't value girls, baby girls. And they would basically do the same thing to girls that Pharaoh is doing here to the boys. So one sex or the other ends up being, singled out because of some effort to control the population, if you will. But in this case, I think we could probably just for a minute locate the Hebrews in Egypt, in Cairo, if you will, living there and basically performing tasks that they were called to do by Pharaoh. They're acting as slaves, but they're laborers, right? They're working. They're also skilled tradespeople. And they have been gone from Israel for so long. They really weren't attached to their faith the way they were before. I'm certain that they wanted to continue their faith, but they didn't have the ability to do so. And now they were living in a huge empire, the Egyptian empire. So no doubt they were probably influenced by its culture, right?
Absolutely. And especially you think through, well, at least my assumption is, correct me if I'm wrong, which I know you love to do. My assumption is that how easy it is to get muddy the waters of your faith. I mean, even now in modernity, we are taught a Christian faith, but then we pull in other pieces of faith around us, whether it's Buddhism, that are like, oh, that makes a lot of sense. Maybe we should do that too. I can't imagine without the vast structure, the load-bearing structure of a religion that just didn't quite exist yet. Even the thought of God, like I could see them having a pluralistic view of gods. Like, sure. Was Pharaoh a god to these people and God? Our God was a god? I could see it just being a really confusing time.
For sure. And we see that what has happened is the Egyptian culture has become imbibed into the Hebrew people. And in fact, once they're set free, there's a fair amount of grumbling about, we should go back to Egypt. At least it's something that we know. So
right.
I do think that they're not relying or leaning on the days of long ago. They're leaning on and focusing on their present reality, although they are groaning under the weight of what was going on, and they are praying constantly to God for somebody to set them free, which had not happened, but will happen with Moses, as we will see. So,
which again is a great idea of how often in our lives do we still do that? We're frustrated by something, we want to be freed from something, we're freed from it, and we go back to it. And even the idea of, I read some commentary that not all Jewish people left. There was a percentage, I've seen the number move around, but as high as 80%, or sorry, only 20% left, according to some scholarly people. I'm not going to say whether that's true or not, but I just read that on, online, which is never wrong.
On Wikipedia? Was that on Wikipedia?
No, it was this whole thread I got into when I was searching some stuff about this.
Well, I think no matter how many stayed, the vast majority left. Okay. And that's probably the truth, that they left. And certainly, even at the time of Christ, when he was born, there were Jews living in Egypt because we know that the Holy Family traveled there.
Absolutely.
So would it be surprising to know that Jewish people lived there from then forward as part, claiming it as their land, right? Or claiming it as where they're from.
So now Moses is here. He's born. He's been around for 40 some years, and then something happens, right?
Yeah. I want to just, quickly talk about his birth and what happened there, because Moses' life is in segments, as you were alluding to. There's the first 40 years when he lives as an Egyptian prince. There's the second 40 years when he lives as a shepherd, basically, in the middle of the desert. And there's the last 40 years of his life when he lives as a servant of God. But a lot of people know something about the birth of Moses because it's this fantastic story where this Levite couple gave birth to a boy, and the mother hid the boy for several months. And rather than turn the boy over to be murdered, she fashioned an ark or a boat. This is one of two times when that word is used in relationship to saving through the waters, if you will. The other time is in Noah, remember? So she put him in the basket. And remarkably, God delivers Moses into the hands of the Pharaoh's daughter, who then takes him and adopts him as her own child. She's the one who named him Moses, and she raises him as an Egyptian. And he lives there, as I said, like royalty for 40 years. And this was the first time that God intervened in Moses' life. And it's also the part of Moses' life that we actually know the least about, like what were his years, his formative years, like living as an Egyptian prince. So, one, we have to look at the courage of the mother, right? The mother acted in such a brave way. Think about that act of putting your child in a basket and sitting him down the river. Now, her daughter, Miriam, who is Moses' brother, sees where he's going and confirms that he's been taken out of the river. So that must have given her some comfort. And then ultimately, his mother becomes his nursemaid. So the mother has a relationship with Moses in a maternal way, even though she's not supposed to have given birth and kept him.
Right.
Kind of a crazy twist of events, right?
Yeah, it's like, is the glass half full or half empty there? I don't know, but it's, again, it's an interesting look at faith in following God. I don't think he told her, hey, everything's going to be okay. It's like, just send them down the river, right? Just like Abraham and Isaac, do the next right thing.
It's the faith walk that we have been spending a lot of time talking about, what it takes to step out in faith with courage and conviction. So here's Moses. He's living there. He's obviously witnessing the Hebrew people in their role as slaves. And the text tells us that one day he went out, this is all in Genesis, he went out to watch the hard labor of his people, the Hebrews. So one, he must have known, he knew at that point that he was a Hebrew, that he's not Egyptian. And while there, he witnesses an Egyptian beating a Hebrew man. And he becomes enraged by what he's witnessing, and he kills that man and buries him in the sand. Now, the text again doesn't tell us exactly how Moses knew, but maybe his mom told him, right? Maybe his sister told him at some point. They'll there also is a brother, Aaron. So in some way, in some form, at some time, he realizes he's not Egyptian. Clearly, he doesn't have the same lineage as the Egyptians, so he would probably also look different, right?
I would. Sounds reasonable.
I just think, the idea that he goes out to watch them work, it's like, did something rise up in him where he was starting to feel like, gosh, this seems wrong? Or was he looking for a connection or something? We don't really know.
No. I mean, if you read into the story, I mean, I half wonder if that's when he figured it out.
Yeah. I think he probably knew that before because, again, it tells us that he went out to watch the hard labor of his people.
That's what I'm saying. Like, did he figure it out and go out to like, wait, I'm one of these people. Like, did something connect the dots? Maybe his mom, his adoptive mother said something, or maybe, I don't know. We don't know. It's fun to kind of play with these stories in our minds and see how it could have happened.
The human nature of people, for sure, somebody told him.
Right.
Right. If somebody knew, somebody told him. But he takes this idea that he wants to, I guess, stand up for his people by killing this guy. And so he commits murder, which is a big deal, and puts him in the sand, taking justice into his own hands, right? Not sure what he thought was going to happen, but Pharaoh found out, and he actually orders for Moses to be killed. So that's, again, a big turn of events in his life. And as you said, at 40 years old, he leaves Egypt and he goes into a town, an area called Midian, and it's this area that's down by the Red Sea. So it's by the Sinai Peninsula is on one side, and on the other side is Jordan in that area. And it's a fairly desolate place, but it's got mountains, and it does have vegetation. And he kind of holes up there in Midian. And he decides
for a hot minute he's there, right?
Yeah. He meets a girl. So that I said, he gets a girl. I shouldn't say even meets her. He's given the girl by her father.
Okay.
Yeah, he's helping the father. Oh, what's his name? It should come to me, and it will in a minute. But he's helping the daughters of this father, and in return for what he did, the father gives him his wife, who is, I don't know why I don't have her name right here. He marries Sephora.
Okay.
Zephora. Yeah, sorry about that. But he goes from living in luxury to this super dry and desolate land. He goes from the life of luxury to the life of scraping out a living. But he seems more than happy to be there, doesn't he? He has a family. He has a son, Gershom. And he speaks to the fact that he says, I am truly a foreigner in a foreign land. And that's true in both places that he had lived, right?
Absolutely.
He lived in Egypt, where he's a foreigner, and now he's living in Midian, still a foreigner. And yet he settles into this life pretty robustly.
Yeah, even so much so that later on, again, this trend of, I don't know if I want to change it, right?
Yeah, I mean, he probably wasn't expecting what happened next to happen. But he is called by God. I'm sure he's surprised by that. And the setup is that even though Moses had left Egypt, everybody else was still there and enslaved, and they were suffering and crying out to God for someone to save them. And the text tells us that their cries reached God, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and he was concerned about his people. So we could see that the covenant comes into play because he had told Abraham that his people would be God's people. And so God is in this position of saving his people from extinction. The longer they were there, the less likely they were probably to get out. And so he creates a plan to get them out of enslavement. And this includes Moses, who's pretty happy with his life and probably wasn't so keen on changing his life, right? And we have to ask, like, when that happens to us, when we have a change of location or a big right turn in our life and we become, I don't know, comfortable with it, do we become too comfortable with what we have and where we're at in life?
Yeah, when I was reading this story and came across it, so I'm just a little over 40 years old.
Yeah.
And so I think about how wild it would be for me to have a complete 180 in my life right now.
Yeah.
Then to move on to, that happens again, right? Of another chunk, you have kids, you have a family, all of a sudden you're like, oh, I'm getting ready just to disappear in obscurity and it's going to be great. And then you're called to do this incredibly hard task. How would I react to all of that? I mean, just even thinking about it made me anxious. I don't know how I would react, but I just know thinking about it, I'm like, I don't want to do any of that.
Well, Moses is 80 years old when he gets called. So he's not a young man, but he lives to 120. And I mean, we might not think of 80 as very robust, but clearly he had to be to do the job he's going to have to do, right?
Yeah, I mean, even if you think, I mean, just so say he was 60, right? Say he was 55 even, right? Say he was 65, somewhere in there. I mean, so we can understand it through how we view life cycles. That's still insane, right? Like, hey, at 55, I want you to do this complete, at 60, this complete 100-degree 80 different thing. And it sounds scary too. And again, it wasn't like, I don't think the end was completely as clear of how the outcome was going to be as probably it looks like in retrospect.
Well, I think helpfully he had a big conversion moment with God, right? So he's on Mount Horeb. Interesting note that I've actually been there on the top of
Did
that.
you see a burning bush?
No, but the burning bush is in St. Catherine's Monastery in the Sinai Desert. It's actually living, it's thriving, it's doing very well. And it's not on fire anymore. So is it the same bush? I'm not so sure, but it's definitely memorialized. There's probably always been a bush there since then. So I want to say that Moses had to have had skills that God really wanted to use. And let's not overlook the fact that when God calls you to do something, he's relying on the skills that you have from your past, right? And you and I talked a little bit about this the other day, that we've had big changes in our life, like when I left my business and turned the kind of what I thought was the opposite direction and went to seminary thinking I was going to start a second career that was somewhat unrelated to my first career. Like, oh, I'm just going to completely start over. And surprise, surprise, I use so many of the skills from those decades I've spent working in my ministry. So it wasn't a separation and a new start. It was a continuation with a new focus or direction. And I think your story about working and having something come to an end was a good story too. So talk about that event.
Yeah, I mean, I spent my early 20s following what I believed was a call of God, and I thought that was going to be my life, and my path was chunked out, and it was going to be brilliant. It was like everything was working great, and it came crashing down. And I was like, just left like, what was that, right? And you know, what did that accomplish and what did that do? It wasn't what I thought the outcome was going to be. The goal clearly wasn't I thought what the goal was going to be, but I also can see God's hand in it and him working in my life in probably ways I had no clue of, setting a foundation to get me further down the road to have a good life.
Yeah, I believe as you get older, like you're 40, I'm older than you. You can look
Just by a little bit.
back, just a titch.
Just a couple years.
You can look back and see how God intervenes to make something happen, to put you in a different path, for various reasons. Maybe it's because he wants to move you closer to him. Maybe it's because, which he always wants. I mean, he always wants that. But maybe it's because he needs you to learn and understand something that you didn't before, and or you needed, like, for example, be more patient, or be nicer, or all the attributes he wants us to have.
You're
But it
picking out
also
very
can
specific
be,
things there, Sandy.
I'm talking about you, not me.
Thanks.
No, of course I'm talking about me. You know, I always tell people don't pray for patience, because you'll get the opportunity to practice that skill a lot. No, I am grateful for every lesson I've learned along the way. But in any case, I do think that Moses had some great skills already. His Egyptian background becomes a huge help. And also his ability to navigate the mountains in the Sinai desert, just that alone, his relationship to the Pharaoh, all those things are really important to making this huge miracle take place. So anyway, God brings Moses to the burning bush, as we just talked about, and he gives Moses this huge assignment, and he says to Moses, okay, it's time to rescue my people from the Egyptians and to get them out of slavery. I'm sure Moses is thinking, and what does that have to do with me? God wants his people back in the land of milk and honey, the land that he had given Abraham so very long ago. He says to Moses, so now I'm sending you to Pharaoh to bring the Egyptians out of Egypt. I'm sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people out of the land of Egypt. Very clear, direct order, but how this is going to get accomplished, this is a discussion that goes back and forth between God and Moses, right? We walked through this discussion the other day. How does Moses react?
Well, I love the bartering of it. It feels so familiar, right? Of like, no, like, not me, right? Like, I mean, especially you think about that he's 80, so by the math, he hasn't stepped foot in this place in 40 years. How long has it been? Probably a decade plus since he's even thought about this place, right? How does he even identify with these people anymore that he hasn't seen in so long? Then you also talked about earlier of what does he think about Pharaoh? Does it seems like he's trying to explain to God who Pharaoh is. Like, no, you don't understand. Pharaoh's not going to do this, right? And I think, again, does Moses fully know who and what God is? It doesn't appear that he does, right? That he doesn't appear that, like, this is the guy that created all. Pharaoh is nothing. Because Moses seems like, wait, hold on, you don't understand. This is Pharaoh. This isn't going to work. And then his last comment, I don't know if the sequence, I think it's the last comment, he talks about, well, I'm not an eloquent person. And then God brings his brother into the conversation. Right.
He brings his brother out of Egypt and to him, to where he is, to help him. And, you know, it's this face-to-face connection that we don't see in the Bible. This may be the only specific example of where it's not just God giving an order to a person or delivering a message through a person. In this case, you have Moses and God talking back and forth about how the plan will unfold. And, you know, as you pointed to, we don't know that he had a very strong understanding of his faith and who Yahweh was, but he knew enough when he was on that mountain to take off his sandals, and he knew he was standing in the presence of something divine. So now he's trying to unravel, like, how will this work with this divine presence compared to Pharaoh? Like, he's trying to balance the scales. How's it going to work? And I do love I love the fact that he has the conversation about, I'm not the man you want, pardon your servant, pick somebody else. Pardon your servant. I'm not the person who will get this job done. And God's already made up his mind, and he becomes angry with Moses. He burns with anger at Moses. So it's kind of a relatable moment if we can put it in the context of our own relationship with God and sometimes what he calls us to do. How eager are we to make significant changes or sacrifices even that God may want us to do?
Absolutely. I mean, this one, and I could be reading the story, unlike Noah, where Noah reacted immediately, and also where Abraham reacted immediately, right? Like,
Yeah.
Abraham was kind of told and he went. Moses doesn't. And I wonder how much of it was humility versus, like, I got a football game to watch. Like, you don't understand. Like, I've got this life that's great, and I don't want to.
Yeah.
And that's kind of how I sense it. I don't know how you sense it or anybody else consuming the story senses it, but I do sense that he's reluctant to move because of he's comfy, which is the whole setup for the story of why probably Israel got in the situation of slavery is they're probably reluctant to move.
It could be a direct reflection of what had happened to the Hebrew people, their complacency about reconnecting to their land and getting out of there. But, what you mentioned was probably right. Moses was a humble guy. He'd been living a very humble life. He had no high expectations. He wasn't into power, but he was willing to be obedient at the end of the day. I think when he said, okay, I'll have your brother Aaron come, then he's like, okay, well, if Aaron's here, that will be helpful.
We'll make it work, yeah.
And he's willing to take God's direction. He's willing to take God's rebuke. And that thus begins this very long endeavor to bring the people out of Egypt. And what I think is also astonishing about the Moses story is the number of miracles, just the sheer number of miracles that get performed. Miracle after miracle after miracle to make this thing happen. It's like an astonishing amount of miracles and power that God brings forward to have this actually happen, right? And to begin with, all of these miracles are detailed in the book of Exodus. It really is a fascinating story to read, and I would encourage everybody to read it because it's very rare that we have the story of one man throughout his entire life, from his birth until his death and his walk with God. So it's significant. He's really unlike any other man who lived, and his calling was certainly greater than any other man. So I love the fact that his first job is to go back to Pharaoh, the mightiest man on earth, and tell him, hey, God wants you to let the people go. And now it becomes, he is delivering a message to Pharaoh, right? God wants you to let the people go. And it becomes less about Moses, because Moses does ask for a while there as the messenger of God, and more about God and Pharaoh squaring off. You have who is undoubtedly the mightiest or the most powerful person on the planet squaring off with God, a God he doesn't really know. Somebody who he thinks certainly cannot have the same might that he does. Egypt's been around 2,000 years. It's a very established civilization. The Pharaoh had all the power. Who is this God of yours to tell me what to do?
Absolutely. I mean, I even wonder how he got a meeting with Pharaoh, right? Because this is going to be a different Pharaoh than he grew up with, chances are, right? Because he'd been gone for 40 years.
Yes.
I mean, most of his relationships you think would have died off. So how did he even get an audience with Pharaoh? And then, yeah, absolutely. I'm sure Pharaoh's heard all this talk about gods and deities his whole life. And when has it actually meant something in his existence? Probably never until right now.
I mean, I don't know specifically whether it's the same Pharaoh, but they certainly knew who he was. Through his 40 years, again, isn't a huge amount of time for a population group or for authorities to keep in mind what had happened before. I mean, he'd been raised as the Pharaoh's grandson. So he shows up, they recognize him, he gets the audience with Pharaoh, and thus starts this battle back and forth. And God uses various and interesting ways to bring Pharaoh into compliance, including the 10 plagues, which are so wonderfully depicted in the movie The 10 Commandments, and other movies have now depicted that. There is a pretty good show that was out recently about Moses and these 10 plagues. So, everybody is surprised, like, why would he do it that way? I think it's not just a message to Pharaoh about his power, but to the people. And not just the people who are Egyptian, but to the Hebrews who are living there. Because the land where the Hebrews lived was not impacted by these plagues the same way it was impacted by the Egyptian lands. Okay. So right off the bat, there's this separating between what's going to happen is going to happen to your people, and my people are going to be protected. Interesting message. So I just a random question. Which of those 10 plagues you think would have driven you the most crazy?
Well, God kills the firstborn, right?
That's the very last one.
That
but
I mean,
they're living.
The blood, the river turning to blood, would have been pretty horrific. I think you could have chalked like the locusts up to just some regional tragedy, right?
Yeah.
But the succession of those, but then I mean the I guess Pharaoh's son dies, isn't it? Something like that.
The last plague is the plague that convinces Pharaoh, because it's the plague of the death of the firstborn son. And the Pharaoh has been so stubborn, and honestly, in part because God made him stubborn, created him to react in a certain way, which was, I don't know, we could talk about that for a long time. Like, why would God want to bend him to his will, but also make him stubborn? But this is what he does. And the final plague is the plague of the death. And God, of course, saves his people by having them, have the symbol on their doorway, the blood of the Lamb, very foreshadowing of Christ, on their doorway, and that the angel of death, the messenger of death, would pass over. And so it's a huge tragedy, because it's not just Pharaoh's son, it's all the Egyptian families. And ultimately, Pharaoh lets him go. He's like, get out.
For a minute, right?
Yeah, for a minute. What happens after that?
Well, they leave for not that long, and he's like, never mind, I want you guys back, and he pursues them, right?
He does. He pursues them. But another miracle, God parts the Red Sea and allows his people to go through, but washes away Pharaoh and all of his horses and chariots. And, that's what Pharaoh thought was his might, horses and chariots. And God was like, oh, no, I've got something way more powerful. It's called nature.
Right.
So I can control that because I made it. And so, the continued just really destruction of the Egyptian people is pretty significant. So that's a fascinating story of them getting out. But then what happens next is also a big chunk of Moses' life is spent navigating these people through the Sinai desert back to Canaan. And it's this massive group of people. Several scholars will say it's 500,000 people. It's 300,000 people. And they're walking with God's provision along the way. He's guiding them of where to go. and with the smoke in front of them and the pillar of light behind them. He's guiding them where to go. And when they stop in the desert, they establish a camp. It's not just a bunch of people lying all over the place, on the ground under the stars. They have a very structured encampment, and God gives Moses the instructions, the very detailed instructions of how to make the tabernacle the place where they can worship. So God removes them from Egypt, and he starts to restore the relationship with him by giving them the proper tools, the proper way to worship him. And this is, led by Aaron, who becomes the chief priest, if you will. And from his lineage comes all of the priests who serve at the temple centuries later. And I think this is kind of a way to think about God has to now find a way to get Egypt out of the people. It's not just that he has to get the people out of Egypt. He has to get the Egyptian way of thinking out of his people.
Yeah, I remember when you first said that in our prep for this. It struck a chord, it struck home. Because often, we talked earlier about patience, but how often does it take to have things happen in our lives? It's rarely the microwave 30 seconds, right? It takes a very long time for us to get where we're going. And I think that idea of it has to get Egypt out of the people is still very current in our lives. Like, we have to remove pieces that we've learned or if we've incorporated into us. And it takes a long time to push those things that might take us away from God to remove those things from our life. And unfortunately, some people, they never, 40 years in the desert, a lot of people didn't make it through. They finished out their lives in the desert.
An entirely new generation that came forward to then populate the land of Canaan. And I do believe this was intentional. I mean, there were things that happened along the way, but it was intentional on God's part to remove the Egyptian way of thinking and to prepare them for the correct way of worshiping God when they got there. Because we can see, like, along the way when Moses goes up to get the 10 Commandments, right? And he's gone for 40 days. What do the people do while he's gone?
And they go make idols and do everything of their old ways.
Right. They're so freaked out that their leader has gone, but they also are not yet relying on God to care for them emotionally or spiritually. I mean, God has been providing, but they are not yet of the mindset of understanding that this is what God wants to do because they are God's people. They are the people of Yahweh. And so they want to resort back to what they had before, what they knew. And I think you're right. And we could always talk about this as the new man and the old, new man, new woman, old man that lives in us, right? There's the way we were before, our old person, and then there's the new person in us. And it's a wrestling match until finally we become the new person that Christ wants us to become. But we don't start off that way on day one.
No. No, I mean, my deep fear of this story is I'm one of the people that just vanishes in the desert because I couldn't complete the journey,
Well, God's time view, as we often talk about, is quite different than ours. But it's not like they didn't have a good life.
Absolutely.
I mean, they had an encampment. They were being provided for. They had relationship. They had each other. They had freedom. They had the ability to worship. They had strong leadership. Sure, they weren't in a specific land, but they also weren't making bricks with no straw. So there was some pluses to it, right? So the most important thing that happens out there is that God gives Moses the quintessential guidebook for how people were to live as God's people. This is, of course, the 10 Commandments and the oral laws that went along with them. As we talked about before, they needed to be instilled with new thinking about what it meant to be people of God. And he's giving them a way to worship him. He's giving the people a way to worship God, and to become more familiar with what God had always wanted, and always was expecting out of his people. And they had to learn these rules, the commandments, and commit to them as a sign of obedience. Yes, and we still have those 10 commandments, don't we?
Yeah, they still work out pretty
part
well
of our
for
lives.
most of them, right?
Yeah. Well, it was a different way of dealing with they was creating a society, a civic society, how they treated each other, how they judged each other, a community of how they were to live, how they were to navigate food and preparation of food, and also relationally what they were to do for each other and how to be a people group. He's fashioning them into the group that he wants, so that when they go, they have more to hold on to than they left in Egypt, right? They had nothing there.
Right.
And now,
well, also, I think he's laying the foundations for the world to flourish and grow beyond what it would have been, right? I mean,
sure.
A lot of the 10 Commandments, we talked earlier, the idea of human life wasn't that valuable.
Right.
10 Commandments started to give us the foundation that human life is incredibly valuable, right? God loves people. He cares for people. And all of these rules are structured to take care of us and give us a flourishing society. I like earlier how you said the word civics. I think there's pieces of that inside these laws. It's not just like, I'm a God and I'm going to make arbitrary rules for you to follow to prove your allegiance to me. I think it's, here's some rules because I love you and I want you to give a good life.
Yeah, I mean, half the 10 Commandments are really relational about people to people, and the other half are relationship to God. So that does make him different than any of the Egyptian gods, because they never cared about people. Their gods, they didn't have a name. Like, God comes out and says to Moses, I am who I am. So he speaks a name, whereas the Egyptians' gods wouldn't have done that. And also he shows deep love and gratitude and caring for his people. Now, Moses wasn't a perfect guy. We've been talking about this with all these guys. They were not perfect, and neither was Moses. And in the end, he commits a sin, and that the people are grumbling, which they seem to have done often, and they want water. And God tells Moses, I will speak the water out of the rock. And Moses, the same guy who killed a guy, however many years before, is impatient, and so he hits the rock twice with his staff. And this is considered disobedience to God, and so the punishment for that, or the response to that, is that Moses is not allowed to actually go into the promised land. He finishes his job outside of the promised land. Instead, it is Joshua who would bring them across the Jordan River to their homeland. He did get to see the Holy Land from a high hill above Jericho, and that is where he died and was taken up to God. And nobody knows where Moses is buried. It was a mystery then. It's still a mystery now. But he did his story is remarkable, and we could spend a long time talking about it.
Absolutely. Here's an off-the-cuff question for you. So at the end of Genesis, when Joseph passes away, he says, he starts to say, like, we need to leave. He says something like that, and take my bones with you when you go. Do you think they remembered that? Do you think they took Joseph?
You mean when Moses dies? Like, he's like...
No, Joseph.
When Joseph, yeah.
So the end of Genesis. So before the Exodus.
Well, I mean, the way that people were handled when they died was that they would prepare their body and put it in a tomb. Then once all of their skin and all the fleshy parts were gone and it was just bones, they would take their bones only and put them in a smaller ossuary box. Okay. So it's not like he's being mummified, by the way, like the Egyptians did. They're just, I guess he wants his bones back from where he started. I think that's a really kind of a beautiful testament to his faith. He had a lot of faith in God. God had brought him through many, many things as well. So this is a big story, and I think we've done a good job covering it, but are there takeaways from this story that you want to share in our last few minutes here?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, yes. To keep it to where we're not talking for another 6 hours is complicated. I mean, the relatability. I remember hearing the story when I was a child and just being so confused about the Hebrews. Like, what's wrong with you? Like, why can't you trust God? And then as I've gotten older, how complicated life is, how complicated or mucky faith is. Maybe because we make it that way. I don't know. And the things that they do seem like, oh yeah, I might see myself doing that. Maybe not of my best days, right? You're stuck in the desert, or you're stuck on this journey, because I think desert brings some different ideas with it, because they were already in a desert type place, right?
Yeah.
But you're stuck not at your destination. And maybe some of the tools we knew work, because I don't know if because again, this was before the 10 Commandments came back to them. You have no other gods, no other idols. I mean, I think they understood what they were doing was wrong. But back to the relatability piece of, I can see myself doing something stupid because my life's filled with that, right? And then how Moses, the 3 segments of life, and how each path took an incredible amount of time to get through.
Yeah.
What about you?
Yeah. I would say I really resonate with this face-to-face relationship with God. I relate to the fact that we can have a face-to-face relationship by praying to Him and being an active listener for His voice in our life. And also I can see there are times when I've argued with God about something and not understood or not wanted to do the hard work. Like, if you really start to think about how to implement what God wants for our life, you have to change how you would respond to different things, how you would act about certain things. And so the fact that Moses prayed about things and God heard his prayers, this is the same for us, and it really speaks to how we are equally as important in the eyes of God as Moses was. And so we don't have to worry or think that we are somehow lesser than Moses. We have to think that really, like Moses, we should be going to God in all things large and small and praying for him, his response and his presence in our life at all times. So I like the idea that he's so important in our lives, and we need to give that a lot more consideration and give him more of our time. So Moses acts as a type of deliverer too in the Old Testament, right? He's delivering people. He's a Christ-like figure. He foreshadows the ultimate redemption that would come through Jesus Christ. Just as Moses led the Israelites out of physical bondage, Christ leads humanity out of spiritual bondage. And spiritual bondage is no joke. It's just as bad as being the slaves in Egypt. And we do need somebody to deliver us out of that. And thank God we have that. So I think Moses is fascinating. I want to make certain that people tune in again and listen to our next discussion about David, King David, who's also a very well-known figure in our story of the path to redemption. So thank you, Jay, for all of your insightful comments and thoughts about it.
So I appreciate you keeping me along for the journey, learning a lot. I hope everybody else is as well.
Yeah, great. Well, if you have any comments about Moses, make sure you put them in the comments section here. We'd love to hear what you think about this story. So take care.
Awesome. Thank you.